Welcome everyone to our section here on global thoughts. I am happy to introduce you to several esteemed guests, what promises to be a wonderful program. My name is Tom Millington, I'm with Abroadia, and we hope that this program will allow you to engage in some interesting thoughts, exchanges of ideas, which we think is a very important part of international education. Before we get going though, I just wanted to mention a couple things. First of all, everyone should be on mute. And if you do have questions, we'll have time at the end for you to ask them. During the conversation, you're more than welcome to send a question via chat, and I'll be happy to forward that to the speakers. So without further ado, I will pass this on to Dr. Anthony Ogden. One more thing I forgot to mention, this will be recorded and will be available within 24 to 48 hours after the debate. So that will be forwarded too, okay? Without further ado, Dr. Ogden.
Tom, if you don't mind, can we not share screen?
Okay, sure. I'll stop this. Oh, there you go.
Oh.
Okay. I
Okay.
wanted to at least show you that first, and then I'll stop.
Okay, very good. Just a moment. Okay, very good. Sorry, I just have my text there, Tom. I wasn't able to see it. Yeah, now I can, and say thank you so much, Tom. I really appreciate you inviting me back to moderate this spring 2021 debate. It's really promising to be quite exciting. And let me say welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's debate. My name is Anthony Ogden, as Tom mentioned, of Gateway International Group, and I'll serve as the moderator today. Now, education abroad programming has grown and evolved over the years, and not surprisingly, so too have the broader rationales driving enrollment. Now, whether enrollment trends are being driven by changing student interests, or whether international leadership and increasing faculty engagement are guiding the direction and scope of programming, the rationales for education abroad have certainly expanded over time. Now, in particular, developing intercultural competence has been a long-held and widely regarded rationale for education abroad. Now, the overall assumption is that education abroad participation can be leveraged to support the development of global-ready graduates who are able to work effectively in international and intercultural settings. Now, for some of us, intercultural learning has been and will likely remain the primary rationale for education abroad. That said, an increasing number of others recognize the importance of graduating students who understand the international dimensions of their chosen disciplines. Increasingly, faculty have begun to argue that the primary purpose of education abroad is to engage students in the study of their disciplines in a broader international context. It's one thing, for example, to study art history in a US classroom, but quite another to see the artwork firsthand and interact with the communities that produced it. So for some, discipline-specific international learning is the primary rationale for sustained support of education abroad. So as education abroad offices struggle to justify their role on university campuses during the pandemic, a reconsideration of the value of an international education has emerged. So I ask, and the focus of today's debate is intercultural learning as a driving rationale for education abroad being diminished in favor of an academic imperative? If so, what does that mean for the relevance of education abroad and the standing of education abroad offices? So for today, we have organized what promises to be a lively and I think quite entertaining debate to discuss these questions. We have two well-known and highly respected international education thought leaders who will share their differing views. One will defend ICC and its continued relevance as a driving rationale for education abroad, and the other will argue for a more academically oriented vision. Now, my role today will be to encourage a respectful and thought-provoking debate that will inspire us to reconsider the driving rationales for education abroad. We will also consider the implications the pandemic has had in shaping the future of international education. In short, my goal today is to help us ponder on how we can best maneuver in this new era. Now, your role will be to determine, now this is very important, your role today will be to determine which debater has the more compelling view. At the end of today's debate, you will be given a choice to vote on who you think what the winner of today's debate is. Now, our rules today are simple. Each debater will be allowed a 2-minute opening statement, after which I will direct questions to each of our debaters, who will be given 2 minutes to respond uninterrupted. His opponent will be offered a 1-minute rebuttal. This will be followed as needed by an open discussion period wherein each debater will be allowed 30-second responses. Now, if necessary, gentlemen, I may choose to mute speakers that have exceeded their allotted time. Now, each debater will also be offered a 1 minute for closing statements if time allows. Now, immediately following the debate, we have invited Dr. Josh Mcewen of SUNY Oswego to be able to serve as a respondent to today's debate, and I'll introduce him a little bit later. Now, today we have selected 3 broad topics, each to be discussed in brief segments. Our segments today are 1, redefining education abroad, 2, intercultural learning versus disciplinary learning as drivers of education abroad, and 3, the continuing relevance of centralized education abroad offices. So following these 3 segments, we will also have a lightning round wherein we will pose your questions to the debaters. So throughout the debate, and I see the chat is already quite lively, so throughout the debate, please post your questions in the chat box. When posting your questions, do indicate to whom you want the question to be directed. We will select among your questions as time allows to be posed to one of our 2 debaters, and each person will be given 30 seconds to respond. So it's a very quick lightning round. So with all of that, and I'm trying to be very quick here so as we can jump right into the debate, let me welcome to the debate stage our 2 preeminent international education thought leaders. These are 2 gentlemen that I have had the great pleasure of getting to know over the years and whose work I respect greatly. First, Dr. Milton Bennett. Dr. Bennett currently directs the Intercultural Development Research Institute located in the US and Italy, and previously he was a tenured professor of intercultural communication at Portland State University. I believe we have folks here today from Portland State. He has a long history of international work, beginning with his service as a US Peace Corps volunteer for 2 years in Micronesia, continuing with many years of consulting and training with university and high school education abroad programs, including most recently with Dartmouth College. And I think I saw John a moment ago from Dartmouth. He originated, and as we all know, he originated the influential developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, which has guided seminal research in the field. And he is also a founding fellow of the International Academy of Intercultural Research. Welcome, Dr. Bennett. And Dr. Mark Salisbury. Now, Dr. Salisbury has spent 25 years in higher education as, get this, a soccer coach, admissions counselor, director of institutional research, and academic administrator. He has a PhD in higher education and studies how colleges and universities succeed or fail in helping students learn and grow. Mark's research on education abroad has been highlighted by NPR, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and Inside Higher Education, among others. He is also the co-author of Study Abroad in a New Global Century. 2 years ago, Mark started Tuition Fit. Check it out. Tuition Fit is a company focused on empowering students and families to solve the lack of college price transparency. Now, when he isn't working on Tuition Fit, and apparently works all the time, Mark is also busy raising 2 boys, pedaling long distances on a stationary bike, and pretending to be an improv comic. Welcome, Dr. Salisbury, and thank you both so much for being here today. Now, before we begin, I also want to take just a moment to acknowledge the importance of diversity of thought, experience, and background. It's not lost on me that our debate, again, this spring, is among older white men. Now, our profession has been built on our collective diversity, which is represented in the good work we all do around the world. So let us celebrate our collective diversity today and into the future. Now, without further ado, let's get started. Dr. Bennett, starting with you, here in the United States and across the world, we have seen fundamental disruptions to international education due to COVID-19. Now, in response, institutions and organizations have cut staff, slashed operating budgets, and have begun consolidating international education functions with other campus units. Now, at this important juncture, what do you think are the critical issues in international education that international education professionals need to be considering as we move forward? You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Tony. Well, speaking as one of those older white males, I'd have to say that it is an existential issue, but it's not an existential issue just for white people. This is an issue that of preparing to live in multicultural societies where cultural differences are not just curiosities that one encounters on an optional sojourn abroad, but are inevitable parts of our everyday life. So to this end, I think that international educators and their compatriots, the domestic diversity and inclusion educators, have a common goal, and that is to teach a new approach to otherness. And by new, I don't mean that we haven't been trying to do this for the last century or so, but new in the sense that it's new in our species' history. And like other creatures in this world, we humans are a product of evolution that apparently entailed our cooperating in relatively large groups, allowing us to dominate our immediate environments, these days rather severely, including attempts to dominate other sapiens who were not us. And these millennia of clashes with otherness are still reverberating today in our ethnocentrism and fear of others. The pandemic and recent political events have made this continuing condition painfully clear. The goal, I think, in both international and domestic diversity education, and what these educators have in common is to expand the idea of us to include all humanity, and to do so without losing the uniqueness of our different expressions of that humanity. We can only celebrate our differences in the context of common humanity, but we can only have common humanity if it includes those differences. And these kinds of multicultural groups are not a natural condition. They're not a natural condition of Homo sapiens, but we can learn to make them work in the same way that mathematics is not a natural human skill, but it can be learned. And like STEM skills, intercultural skills must be learned for us to survive in the world we have created. That, I will argue, is that our part of the educational mission.
Okay, that was deep. And so let me just remind everybody, this is being recorded. So if you're like me, you're going to want to go back and listen to what Dr. Bennett just stated. And so thank you very much for that comment. And Dr. Salisbury, let me ask you the same question. What do you think are the critical issues we need to consider moving forward?
Well, I'm going to start out by saying I agree with everything that Dr. Bennett just said. However,
this is a debate, Mark.
Yes, I set up that straw man to, anyway. My point is, though, that there is a practical reality for those of us in professional roles in international education. And that reality is that we still need to have our jobs, and we still have a role to play in higher education institutions. And we still have offices that can play a really important role on our campuses, because we're supposed to be contributing to the larger learning of all students. And the one thing I think we've learned over the past year that was already starting to become apparent prior to the pandemic is we are not at our best when we are one-trick ponies, when we are only about processing study abroad applications or making sure that someone has the proper insurance and the shots. And the same is true if the only thing that we can talk about is how every study abroad experience has to be about intercultural learning. Otherwise, it's somehow not valid. Not that that might not be something we should shoot for, but in the context of the work that we do, and the context of higher education's continued difficult space in continuing to survive as entities, we can't do that work very well if there's no more office on our campus, or if half of our staff is gone. So we have to be more than one-trick ponies, and we have to be able to facilitate learning across all of the different ways that students can learn and toward all of the outcomes that students need to learn while they are in college.
Very, very important. Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you both. Again, thanks for being here today. Let's jump into segment 1. Dr. Salisbury, to begin with you. Today, the Forum on Education Abroad defines education abroad in part as enrollment in courses, experiential learning, internship, service learning, and other learning activities which occurs outside the participant's home country. Now here, the definition is explicitly focused on programming outside one's home country. Now, given the changes to education abroad programming brought about by the pandemic or accelerated by the pandemic, this move to online learning and virtual learning, do we need a new definition of education abroad? If so, what do you suggest? You have 2 minutes.
We absolutely need a new definition of study abroad and or education abroad, as you put it. And I would argue that that definition has to stop thinking about the word abroad and start thinking far more about the word education. The experience that we have always tried to provide is really about providing a fertile ground within which, or on which, or in which students have an opportunity to grow and learn. I don't think any of us really ever believed that when a student studies abroad, they automatically become fully developed. And if the issue was about intercultural learning, that the student is now a fully developed cross-cultural ninja, and suddenly everything's great. We all know that what happens is they get some learning experience, they get some disequilibrating experiences, and then after they have experienced them is the process by which you either sort of take those things and put them into yourself, or forget about them and put them in the pictures in the box under the bed, right? And what we're supposed to be providing then, or what we do provide, is that education opportunity. And the definition that I think we need to move to is a definition that emphasizes the education part. The abroad part comes from a time in which you walked across a border and there was no internet. And you might get lucky to get postcards across the border. Those times aren't around anymore. I don't know how to say it in a better way. Things have changed mildly. This internet thing, I think it's going to take off. I think it has a shot. The point being is our definition has to reflect the reality in which we live.
Well, this is a very interesting comment, Mark, and it takes me back to the feeling that I've had over the years that just because a student goes abroad, we shouldn't claim that they've been transformed somehow just because they got on an airplane and went somewhere, right? Actually, it reminds me of a comment Dr. Bennett made so many years ago that one can be in the vicinity of international events and maybe not learn much, or have an American experience in the vicinity of other events. Dr. Bennett, would you like to respond or pick up on any of that? Let's unmute you there. Yeah.
Right. Let me return the favor, Mark, by saying I agree with what you're saying too. There are these practical issues. I particularly agree with the idea that study abroad is becoming a kind of archaic notion. Dartmouth is using the term study away to try to get away from the idea, no pun intended, that this is only abroad. I would argue for using the term intercultural learning to move along your idea that this is an educational activity, and that intercultural learning is something that ideally would accompany all educational activities, not exclusive of study abroad. I think that there will continue to be sojourns, but that intercultural learning will continue and needs to continue to be an intentional, facilitated part of that, as well as other kinds of experiences.
Very, very interesting. It's, there was also, we frequently use the term to study overseas. You can study abroad without actually physically going overseas. And so I think this is another term that we might want to address in our vernacular. So Dr. Bennett, let me ask you another question here in segment 1. Institutions and organizations around the world are eagerly exploring expanded uses of technology and online delivery to offer more responsive programming that meets the needs of a new generation of virtually engaged learners, and to offer more diverse populations of learners the benefits of international learning and engagement. What do you see as the potential opportunities or the challenges ahead for engaging students in meaningful international learning and intercultural engagement in this new space?
Well, I think thanks for that question, Tony. I think that the new technology is really a wonderful opportunity for the facilitation of intercultural learning. We know that intercultural learning does not occur accidentally. It is not incidental. This is the key learning from the Georgetown study. Most of you know that entailed a wide variety of study abroad programs. And that a key finding was the intervention idea, the idea that there needs to be facilitation. In other words, that the research supported this long-term observation that intercultural learning is not a happy side effect of real study. It is, in fact, something else that needs to be learned, as I said earlier. And of course, George Kelly, the psychology of personal constructs, has this as his experience corollary, that you can be in the vicinity of events when they occur, but that doesn't mean that you've had the experience of those events, and that an American in France is not having a French experience necessarily as having an American experience in the vicinity of French events. The way that the student has a more experience of otherness, whether that be French or otherness in a domestic context, is through facilitation. The facilitation of self-reference, the facilitation of reflection. And this has to be done by people who know what they are doing. So the opportunity of this new technology really is for us to be able to bring in skillful, knowledgeable educators who are able to team up with specialist faculty to bring the kind of expertise necessary to facilitate this kind of learning.
Thank you. Dr. Salisbury, I want to pose the same question to you to see if you have any response to that. I just want to say, to be very specific, if you can students become interculturally competent in virtual programming? I hear that there are studies happening right now, but I've not seen much robust research on this at the moment. Have you? Any thoughts?
Well, I have not seen, put it this way, I have seen plenty of research that's attempted to try to get at the degree to which students grow and change as a result of education abroad or education away. And oftentimes what you find is students don't change that much. And that's a function of, even if you do a pre and post study, whether it's in a virtual environment or in an actual environment, you often see the students don't change that much. Mm-hmm. What we often don't study is what happens 6 months after they've gotten back. We don't actually test that very often. In the few studies that I am aware of that have gathered data on students' intercultural growth months or years after studying abroad, what we find is that there's a whole bunch of things that have happened in the intervening period that have shaped whether that intercultural learning stuck or whether it receded. This is not just like lots of educational outcomes, this is a continually contested issue, right? Because you're asking somebody to grow and change, and then you're taking them from one context into another, in which many times that new context says, don't grow and change. Anybody who reads The Onion has seen headlines and articles that point out this fact, right? So I think there's there's not a lot of research that says that somehow the virtual environment does something unique. It certainly can expose more students to the opportunity to engage, but that's just the starting point. And I do want to point to something else that Dr. Bennett said that strikes me as a particular concern. Faculty are generally taking students abroad, or they're leading the study abroad programs, whether they're at location or from one institution to another. And I don't know how much experience most people have had in trying to help faculty develop new skills. I have some experience doing that. Wonderful people trying very hard, working very hard in their discipline, asking them to learn to teach something that's very foreign to their abilities or their inclinations. That's why you need to bring in some sort of experts. That is a whole nother level of staffing, a whole nother level of cost, a whole nother level of infrastructure that adds to the difficulty in asking every faculty member in every study abroad program to have this as a central piece of it.
Interesting thoughts. Thank you very much. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to jump into our second segment. And Dr. Bennett, I'll start with you. Dr. Bennett, your developmental model of intercultural sensitivity arguably shaped education abroad programming and outcomes assessment research over the last 25 years. It's influenced many international educators like me to design and promote education abroad programming to support intercultural learning among our students. Now today, industry demands are calling for shorter degrees, unbundling and stackable credentials, tech-savvy graduates, and so on. Now, arguably, virtual international programming offers little, in my opinion, little potential for deep intercultural learning. Now, what do you see as the continued relevance of intercultural learning today and as a driving rationale for education abroad? So, in other words, is intercultural learning still relevant?
Well, I think, Tony, that it's more relevant than ever. As I said in the beginning, we were preparing to live in conditions that we haven't lived in before, in multicultural conditions, and that intercultural learning is the skill that we need to have socially to be able to do that. It's the parallel to learning how to deal with technological innovation. There are various dimensions of the continued relevance, or the new context of relevance of intercultural learning. One of them is to not have it tied exclusively to study abroad or to study away. That we have a long history of being able to do what we used to call the Intercultural Communication Workshop, which is a domestic campus-based program in which we recruited a maximum diversity in groups of 12 people, put a couple of well-trained facilitators who knew what they were doing into those groups, and showed again and again and again that over a period of 30 contact hours with the sort of normal academic support for that, that we were able to bring about significant increase of intercultural skill. Now, I'd argue a little bit with Mark that the goal here is not to change people. The goal is to increase people's repertoire. The goal is to give people new skills, new abilities to be able to deal with situations. And that's what the Intercultural Communication Workshop did. It was through the workshop that we learned that cultural generalizations need to be sanctioned and differentiated from cultural stereotypes. We understood that you need to do culture general work before you do culture specific work. We learned that the goal of intercultural learning is empathy, not just tolerance. A lot of things came out of that initial research and experience with the Intercultural Workshop. That continues, and I would argue is even more relevant to be doing that kind of educational work.
Let me just seek a clarification there. I think the literature is very clear that intervention or programming can support intercultural learning. There's no doubt that education abroad has strong potential to support intercultural learning or competency development, however we want to look at it. But is it still should it still be a driving rationale? Go abroad for intercultural learning. Should that be a driving rationale still today?
Well, I think so. I think that if you look at the mission statements of most organizations, universities as well as private organizations that are sponsoring study away, study abroad, you find that as a goal. That the goal is not you will learn about art in the context in which that art was generated. That's almost a secondary issue. The primary issue is you will have an experience. What kind of experience? An experience, I would call it, of otherness. And that is touted as the outcome. We have the responsibility to facilitate that outcome because we know it doesn't happen by accident.
Dr. Salisbury, what do you think?
Well, and unfortunately, I think Dr. Bennett just made a good argument for study abroad offices to be closed. Because if the idea here is to develop intercultural competence, and it can be done right on campus with 30 hours of work, just pulling together the group of students. And as our student bodies become more diverse, we ought to be able to pull together an even more fertile environment right on campus. If we can do that right on campus, why in the world would we spend the money as an institution and ask the students to spend the money to go abroad to do it? So if the goal, if we focus study abroad as education is only about intercultural competence, and then prove that we can do that on campus, then we really invite an institution that's already in financial trouble to say, yeah, you know what, outsource the whole thing. I argue that is exactly why you need to make the goal of the study abroad office is to facilitate learning across all the different outcomes that are possible and a part of that institution's mission statement, whether it's disciplinary, whether it's leadership development, whether it's individual skills that allow students to have grit and persistence under difficult conditions, whatever those goals are. And I think a lot of them oftentimes dovetail anyway. If the study abroad or the education abroad office or the education away, whatever dimension we want to use to talk about away, virtually or otherwise, if the study away office is a facilitator of learning across all of those outcomes and enables that learning to happen more effectively, that office becomes much more centrally important to the institution's success and becomes a much more vital piece of that institutional puzzle. And I think is therefore far more likely to be seen as critical, as core to the organization, and not vulnerable to the kind of cuts that we have seen and we will continue to see if it's merely about processes, if it's merely about document processing, and if it's only focused around one outcome.
Very interesting. Your comments, Mark, make me reflect on over the past 10 years or more, I've probably have worked with hundreds of faculty members who were developing cohort-based programs, faculty-directed programs abroad. And it was only on a very rare occasion where a faculty member ever mentioned to me that their goal was to support the intercultural learning of their students. So that leads me to the question I want to ask you now, Dr. Salisbury. In a 2020 article for the Chronicle of Higher Education entitled, that you wrote for the Chronicle of Higher Education, it was entitled, "We're Muddying the Message on Study Abroad." And in that article, you argue that the claims about the potential educational value of study abroad sometimes sounds a bit like a late night TV infomercial. It slices, it dices, it calculates pi, as you wrote. Now, already before the pandemic, the majority of our students were studying abroad on very short cohort programs, often on itinerant programs that actually allow for very little intercultural exchange. Now, in your opinion, is it time to stop referencing intercultural learning as the driving rationale for education abroad and be more forthcoming now you've already hinted about this, but already be more forthcoming about the academic potential of international learning. 2 minutes.
Well, I think that we, as a field, have put ourselves in a pretty vulnerable position by using our ideal, what we would hope to happen, as the thing that then we say that we do. And higher education has done that anyway, right? We're not alone in that problem. But I think we have really gotten ourselves in trouble by saying, well, this happens, and it happens because they go. And then we'll just track how many students go abroad and call it good. The article I wrote, I think you said 2020. Sadly, it was 2012.
No, I did mean 2012, sorry.
Yes. And I don't think anything's really changed since then. In fact, I think it's become even more important that one of the first things that we have to do as a field is just be honest. And that's not a bad thing, but just be honest about what we do and what it can contribute and how it contributes. Because I think once we do that, we're going to be in a much better place to then contribute more and be more vital to the rest of the institution. And I think one of those things is to say, we would like to see intercultural learning be something that students develop. We see why that's important, but that is not our only thing. And we are not a one-trick pony. We can help faculty develop in every single way that they develop so that they can teach their students. I really do think that we need to just kind of move away from that as a way of thinking and framing what we do.
Thank you. Dr. Bennett, would you like to respond?
Yeah, in 1987, NAFSA commissioned a book that was edited by Joy Reid on professional development in education abroad. And I wrote a chapter for that called Theoretical Foundations for Intercultural Learning. And it was known then that the ideal condition of the education abroad professional was to be a facilitator of intercultural learning, exactly as Mark is suggesting, that insofar as the education abroad offices were essentially travel agencies, they were not going to be negotiable in an academic context. But this is a well-established idea in education abroad professionals. And I think that Mark is referring to whether that's being done well or not. And I think in some institutions, many of which I've worked with and others that I just know about, it is being done well by knowledgeable professionals who indeed take their field seriously and thus offer an important resource to the university in general and specifically to faculty. This is not an accidental condition in the professional education abroad people. This is the goal since at least 1987.
Very good, very good. Okay, in the interest of time, I want us to jump straight away into segment 3, and we'll be a little bit more expedient about this. But this is a particularly contentious segment of the debate here. And so, Dr. Bennett, I want to go straight to you with the first question, and that is, there are many education abroad professionals that state they are waiting excitedly for things to get back to the way they were, or to get back to normal. Should we be excited about the return to mobility programs with all of their problems of access, limited durations, and preference for familiar Western destinations? If not, what might be a new normal for education abroad? 2 minutes.
The new normal for education abroad is that it's one way that you can experience otherness along with whatever the disciplinary issues or disciplinary advantages are for doing that. Faculty-led programs that say, experience art in its context. But in addition to that, we're having an experience of otherness that needs to be facilitated by people who know what they're doing in partnership with those faculty, if the faculty themselves are not interested in doing that. But that's only one track. There are other tracks for intercultural learning. I mentioned one of them, which is the domestic campus-based intercultural communication workshop. There are also many opportunities for domestic exchanges that allow us to use our own diversity, whatever that might be, in our various societies, as the basis for these kinds of exchanges. We know from early days in the US, for instance, around busing, which was the desegregation of schools, that in a largely unsuccessful program, the successful examples where busing actually worked were ones where it was treated as an exchange program, basically. You know, there was an exchange of information. How do you do things in your community? How do you do things in your community? And people then visited each other in a way that actually generated that condition that I talked about at the beginning, which is both commonality and uniqueness. We see that we are all human, and we see that we're expressing that humanness in different ways. That can be done in a variety of ways, of which study abroad is simply one.
Well, I really appreciate that. You know, I've long always considered education abroad or international mobility to be but one methodology to reach our goal. And now, perhaps thanks to the pandemic, is that now we're seeing more greater mainstreaming of other methodologies for intercultural learning, or whatever the goal might be for you, to be able to be deployed with our students, for all students, not just the more elite students that are able to participate in international education abroad. Now, Mark, unless you're burning to respond, I want to jump into the next question for you.
There is no burning.
Okay, thanks. So in a 2019 book chapter, Dr. Kathy Sedalia of Indiana University argued that if we're successful, international learning and engagement will be embedded into the curriculum and campus life, thus potentially rendering a centralized education abroad office irrelevant. Now, I wonder if increased course level internationalization and virtual programming like we're seeing now, such as COIL and so on, should be forcing education abroad offices to reframe their relevance on campus, to adjust their systems and structures to accommodate these other forms of international learning and engagement. So in other words, are education abroad systems and structures tied to funding models becoming obsolete?
Higher education is famous for this notion of silos, right? And I am participating in this event from the great state of Iowa, where silos are very common, right? The silos are part of the problem, right? Because now if you're a silo, you are by yourself, and you are, if you're eliminated, it doesn't change the state of Iowa. They just have one less silo that many people don't even know exists, right? Because they don't go to that silo. The same thing is true here on the administrative side. The degree to which institutions organize themselves in such a way that each office is responsible for one particular thing, and that particular thing only, sets in motion the possibility that that particular thing just becomes obsolete when, for example, technology takes over. Look at in the professional world of accountants or lawyers and all the different ways that people can use technology to do what those professionals used to do. So if we focus, if everything gets embedded in a framework that's still about curriculum and individual courses, we are still on a track toward silos. Learning happens when you integrate, right? And we all know this, who've studied college student learning, is that it's not just what happens in one class, it's what happens when students take what they've learned in one setting and are integrating that into another setting. That's when the learning really becomes more permanent. And to the degree that if we are to take this profession and move it forward in a way that remains a core element of the institution and our mission, we have to not be a silo, and we have to not be vulnerable to being portrayed as a silo. We have to be a facilitator of learning, and that means an integrator across experiences and across disciplines and across entities on the campus.
Thank you very much for that. I just want to point out in the chat that John Lucas of ISEP has offered another word.
Yes.
Another concept of silos. He calls them cylinders of excellence. Thank you, John, for that point. Dr. Bennett, any response to that before we jump into our lightning round?
Yeah, the cylinders of excellence sort of goes in the direction that I would go, which is that a silo, insofar as it's isolated from other conditions, certainly, as Mark said, is asking for obsolescence. On the other hand, academe is built on fields of expertise. It's built on territories of expertise. What gives a discipline its focus is that people know what a history of theory and research is in that particular field. Intercultural education, intercultural learning needs to be that kind of a field. It doesn't have to have the same disciplinary cachet as psychology or sociology, but it does need to have a well-specified a boundary that differentiates what it's doing from what cross-cultural psychologists are doing or from what anthropologists are doing. And if it defines that well, as we were talking about, as I said, already in 1987, then it can place itself as an integral and ongoing part of the educational effort of the organization.
Well, thank you very much for that. And thank you both. I want to jump into our lightning round, and it's really going to be lightning. So 30 seconds or less, folks. I'll pose the first question, and Tom, I know, is monitoring the chat to see other questions. The first question, the one that really jumped out at me about language learning. You know, we talked earlier at my introduction about the driving rationale being intercultural learning or academic learning. But of course, we know that there are many other rationales. And of course, cultural learning and language learning have been some of the primary rationales for education abroad over the many decades, at least as we understand it here in the United States. What about language learning? Where does that fit into all of this?
Which person do you want to start first?
Oh, well, actually, let me start with Dr. Bennett, if you don't mind, Mark.
Yeah. Language learning has, of course, language and culture are interrelated to one another. If you use, the linguistic relativity notions that have been sort of recently resurrected from the criticisms that people had of the original Whorf and Sapir hypotheses. But these days, I think that there's, amongst cognitive linguists anyway, there's been a resurgence of the idea that language and culture reflect one another in ways so that when you study language, that gives you insights into culture and vice versa. The problem with language learning per se is that when it's looked at only in a syntactic or even semantic way without either the pragmatic dimension or it's being recognized as a reflection of culture, that it becomes a technical exercise and something that doesn't really contribute to experiences of otherness. That if we want language learning to work properly, we need to bring the same attention to facilitating intercultural learning as part of that we do to learning other kinds of technical skills.
Thank you. Maybe one real quick point for Dr. Salisbury. There have been a number of comments in the chat today about this conversation, this whole notion of intercultural learning is sort of being generalized from a Western perspective to an Eastern perspective. Do you see that?
Well, I now have 25 seconds to deal with that question.
20.
So I don't see that issue as something that is particularly at the level of where most students are at. Most students are at a place where they just need some kind of introduction with other and understand how to navigate other. And I do think that this is where we can dive in the weeds because we know enough about it. But if we're going to have the effect that we're going for, I think that's actually a rabbit hole that could get us in more trouble than actually helps us.
Very, very interesting. Well, folks, I can't believe this time has gone by so fast. I have about 1,000 more questions I'd love to ask you, but we just don't have time, and I'm sure others will. Again, the session is being recorded, and you'll be able to correspond with our debaters later. But let me just ask both of you, gentlemen, if you could just in 45 seconds, give a closing statement. Dr. Bennett, can we start with you?
Okay. I think that this session has really been important in suggesting that intercultural learning needs to be something broader, but I would argue something deeper than simply facilitating education abroad. That education abroad may be a context in which intercultural learning occurs, but it can and should be occurring in other contexts as well. And let me repeat that our natural condition is not to live in pluralistic societies. The heritage that we have inherited from our species history is to avoid people who are different from us. And if we can't avoid them, to try to dominate them, to convert them to be like us, then it's okay for them to be around. And if they resist that, well, then we kill them. And that's our history. The 200,000 years we've been doing that. We should be spending less time, or why should we be spending less time educating ourselves about how to counteract this species history than we spend learning how to deal with new technological innovation, of learning how we're dealing with underlying physics and philosophy. Those are important subjects. I completely agree. Mm-hmm. And yet, if we don't deal with this underlying issue of how it is that we as human beings are moving into a new phase in our relations with one another, it's unclear that other kind of learning is going to survive.
Thank you very much. 45 seconds, Mark.
Well, intercultural learning needs to be an outcome of higher education. And it needs to be a part of the entire educational process and the goals of a higher education institution. And we've already talked about the different ways that students can develop those skills through lots of different ways, lots of different processes, on campus, off campus, away, virtually, away, in person, all that. Great. But the question for this event was the Education Abroad Office and its relevance on campus. And for the Education Abroad Office to remain relevant on campus, and more than relevant, but critical to the institution's goals, yes, intercultural learning has to be part of it, but that cannot be the only place that we hang our hat.
Thank you very much. And I know we're running out of time, but I definitely want to welcome with open arms Dr. Josh Mcewen. Dr. Mcewen is the Associate Provost for International Education and Programs at SUNY Oswego and the author of the very popular book, if you don't know it, rush out and get it, The First Time Effect. Now, Dr. Mcewen, based on what you've heard today, what are your thoughts on this discussion? 2 minutes.
Yes, well, thanks to Tony and to both the participants. I thought it was really an excellent discussion. I'll start with Dr. Bennett. So I think it was a particularly strong point he made about how intercultural learning is an existential issue for life. So beyond education abroad and higher education, I thought that was very important to make. And especially that we need a new approach to learning of others. And for many people in education abroad, that's sort of baked into the cake, but it needs to be repeated. I thought that was very strong. I think importantly also, he mentioned about understanding the idea of us while retaining cultural richness. In this era that we're living in, sort of this last, especially decade or so, that could have particular relevance, I think. And may resonate with people who weren't part of this discussion before, really celebrating who we are as well as who we want to learn about. I didn't necessarily see the link with study abroad in those comments, however. I think he was referring more to the broader discussion, and I think that really speaks to this whole debate's importance of to what degree does intercultural learning fit with education abroad. On the point of the definition of study abroad, I think Dr. Bennett was important in really stressing it's archaic. It's an archaic notion, and both really commented on that. But this is consistent with Dr. Bennett's work, really that intercultural learning can be a framework and can be developed in ways perhaps beyond education abroad. I think on the role of technology, Dr. Bennett's point about that it can be useful for intercultural learning was relevant also by his acknowledgement that even in non-technology traditional study abroad settings, oftentimes they weren't conducive for intercultural learning. I think that was an important point to remind us of, that instead the way to do it is through facilitation. What I didn't get from those comments though from Dr. Bennett is still clarity on how central that should be to higher education. It could be an outcome, but how central should it be? But overall, his points were very good on that, particularly on France example. You can have a French experience without experiencing France. I thought that was a really good way to say that. In closing, I think Dr. Bennett's crucial point that intercultural learning is more relevant than ever. I think that's a very, very good year to make that case, but it should not be tied exclusively to education abroad. And really, his statement of the goal of empathy, not tolerance, I think we're hearing a lot about that. So that the ability to tie that to intercultural learning could have a new audience. Perhaps the best point that Dr. Bennett made was acknowledging that intercultural learning has always been done well at times and at other times not, including on education abroad and on campus. So overall, I think despite his obvious passion for intercultural learning, Dr. Bennett should be noted for really his humility and reasonableness on the limits of intercultural learning and what can be done with it, including on education abroad. For Dr. Salisbury, I think is an eminently practical approach. I think his stressing that intercultural learning is important for all students, and that it's important for all students to learn what education abroad has to offer, not just those who go. And consistently, he made the point about not being one-trick ponies or not being silos, and that not every education abroad experience should be intercultural learning based. He acknowledges repeatedly, and I think it's important this year especially, that he says higher education is in a difficult space right now. What are we going to be? And to the extent that education abroad and international offices are tied into sort of one thing, that makes us vulnerable. That's a very good point he made. What I didn't hear from Dr. Salisbury though was, to what extent does our work, our offices, how robust should they be? How expensive should they be? I mean, these are unanswered questions, but I would hope that we'd be thinking about that too. He was very clear that education abroad needs a due definition. Absolutely, we need it. And focusing on education more than abroad. The idea of going abroad, he suggests, was from an era of postcards, pre-internet, which I think is well understood. But what I would like to have heard from Dr. Salisbury, though, is what accounts for the popularity of this travel then? Because really the popularity is huge. And so students clearly want to do it. So we have to figure that out. I didn't hear that mentioned really. What do we do with that popularity? Students want to take part. So what do we do with it now? He acknowledges, just to sum up here, that with the technology question, that the stickiness of intercultural learning has not been proven for study abroad and other things, but the technology can be a good starting point, as long as he says we don't end there. What I would have liked to heard, though, would have been, if we're not a silo, if we're not a one-trick pony in general, what are we? He began to answer that later with focus on leadership development, perseverance, and other goals too. So I think there's more to be done and said on that. Overall, I think his stress to us to be honest about who we are and what we do, and to contribute to the institution overall, not just intercultural learning, was probably his strongest point. I've argued elsewhere in the book, Tony mentioned, not to be into intercultural straitjackets, is how I phrased it. Not that it's a bad outcome, but that should not be our only outcome. And so I agree with him.
I'm going to step in if you don't mind. And we're at the top of the hour.
Okay, I was done. I was just going to say, overall, the practicality of Dr. Salisbury's approach really is vital to this discussion. I commend him for that. So with that, I'll close.
Thank you very much, Dr. McKeown. I really appreciate it. And let me also just say, before we turn to our voting, thank you so much to Drs. Bennett, Dr. Salisbury, Dr. McKeown, and of course, thanks so much to Abroadia, Tom Millington, for hosting today's debate. It's a lot of fun. Gosh, I'm leaving with so many ideas, but now it's your time, folks. It's your time to vote on who you think was the winner of today's debate. Tom? So you'll see a poll popping up now. Please vote. And as you do that, if you have any questions about today's debate, feel free to write to Tom Millington or myself. Again, the recording will be posted on Abroadia's website. And if you have any questions or any suggestions rather for an upcoming debate, do let us know. And let's see, the poll has still about 25, maybe 10 seconds. Oh, it's tight, folks. If you've not voted, get in there now because there's a lot at stake.
Tony, you could do horse races if you have extra time.
Fair enough, fair enough.
Very
Well, there it
close,
is.
very close.
You know, I actually, no offense to Mark, but I had my money on Dr. Bennett, but it looks like our winner today is Dr. Mark Salisbury. Congratulations, Dr. Salisbury. You won today's debate, and for your service today, of course, all of your volunteers and your time is so much appreciated. My company, Gateway International Group, will make a donation in your name today to the Fund for Education Abroad. So thank you so much for all of the work that you do to advance international education, however we define it, whatever the goals may be. Thank you all very much. Back to you, Tom.
Okay, well, thank you, Tony. And again, thank you, Milton. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Josh. This was a lot of fun. This was a lot to digest, a lot of information. In fact, I was trying not to get too involved in some of the conversations that were going on in the chat. Before we end this, I just want to say that we are going to record this. I mean, this is recorded, and it should be available within the next 24 to 48 hours. But also, we have recorded the chat, and so that transcript will be available also in the next 24 or 48 hours because there were a lot of very good discussions, a lot of ideas and insights exchanged there. I just could not keep up, and we simply just do not have enough time to address them all. So again, thank you very much. I want to thank all of you for joining us. This was a lot of fun, and we will probably do this again very soon. Okay, thank you, Milton. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Mark. And thank you, especially Tony, for making this happen. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. A lot of fun.